Good evening. Welcome to the Princeton Public Library. I'll introduce myself in just one moment, but first I'd like to make an announcement about this space's accessibility. The community room is T-coil enabled. If you have T-coil enabled devices, please feel welcome to switch them on at this time. If you don't have a T-coil enabled device but would like to use one of our headsets, I've made some available on the small table by the entrance. I'll also request that you silence your cell phones for the duration of this program. My name is Cliff Robinson, and I am the Public Humanities Specialist here at the Princeton Public Library. Public Humanities programs at the library are made possible in part due to support from generous community members and from the National Endowment for the Humanities, which contributed to the library's own Humanities Endowment and established its Public Humanities Initiative. It is my honor to introduce our featured guests, two distinguished scholars well acquainted with each other's work and, as I gather, also with one another. Marnie Sandweiss is a historian of the United States with particular interests in the history of the American West, visual culture, and public history. She is the author or editor of numerous books on American history and photography. Her publications include Passing Strange, A Gilded Age Tale of Love and Deception Across the Color Line, a finalist for the Los Angeles Times Book Prize in History and the National Book Critics Circle Award in Biography, and Print the Legend, Photography and the American West, winner of the Organization of American Historians Ray Allen Billington Award for the best book in American Frontier History and the William P. Clements Award. Her other works include Laura Gilpin, An Enduring Grace, winner of the George Whittenborn Award for Outstanding Art Book, and the co-edited volume, The Oxford History of the American West, winner of the Western Heritage Award and the Coffee Western History Association Prize for the Outstanding Book in Western History. Tonight she presents her The Girl in the Middle, a recovered history of the American West, published by Princeton University Press in April. PUP describes this book in the following way. In 1868, celebrated Civil War photographer Alexander Gardner traveled to Fort Laramie to document the federal government's treaty negotiations with the Lakota and other tribes of the Northern Plains. Gardner, known for his iconic portrait of Abraham Lincoln and his visceral pictures of the Confederate dead at Antietam, posed 6 federal peace commissioners with a young Native girl wrapped in a blanket. The hand-labeled prints carefully name each of the men, but the girl is never identified. As the girl in the middle goes in search of her, it draws readers into the entangled lives of the photographer and his subjects. Martha A. Sandweiss paints a riveting portrait of the turbulent age of Reconstruction and westward expansion. She follows Gardner from his birthplace in Scotland to the American frontier as his dreams of a utopian future across the Atlantic fall to pieces. She recounts the lives of William S. Harney, a slave-owning Union general who earned the Lakota name Woman Killer, and Samuel F. Tappan, an abolitionist who led the investigation into the Sand Creek Massacre. She identifies Sophie Mousseau, the girl in Gardner's photograph, whose life swerved in unexpected directions as American settlers pushed into Indian country and the federal government confined Native peoples to reservations. Spinning a spellbinding historical tale from a single enigmatic image, The Girl in the Middle reveals how the American nation grappled with what kind of country it would be as it expanded westward into the aftermath of the Civil War. Marnie is joined tonight in conversation by scholar, biographer, poet, and essayist Esther Schor, the John J. F. Sherrard 52 University professor and professor of English at Princeton University. Her 2006 biography, Emma Lazarus, won the National Jewish Book Award. She has published 3 books of poems, including The Hills of Holland and Strange Nursery, New and Selected Poems, with poets Mina Alexander and Rita Dove. She is also the co-author of Poems for Sarah, a bilingual collection about the Venetian intellectual Sarah Copia Solam. Her scholarship includes Burying the Dead, The British Culture of Mourning from the Enlightenment to Victoria, and The Cambridge Companion to Mary Shelley. A cultural historian of the Esperanto movement, her most recent book is Bridge of Words, Esperanto and the Dream of a Universal Language. Recently, she was awarded an NEH Center for Jewish History Fellowship and a Guggenheim Fellowship to support her research on a biographer of the philosopher Horace M. Cowan. I'm grateful to Marnie and Esther for being here with us this evening. Let's thank them for coming to the library.
Cliff, thank you, and thank you so much for the great work you do here at the library. We're all very grateful. Let's have a hand. Marnie, what a pleasure. I want to thank you for your remarkable book. I have enjoyed so much reading it, and I find so much to admire here. For one thing, the detective work, the dogged and ingenious detective work, and I hope we'll be talking more about that tonight, to find the pieces of this story to tell. And also your range as an historian is remarkable. You write about war, you write about the history of photography, Western expansion, scrapes with the law, legal proceedings, the Native Americans, misogyny, etc. So let's start with this image, this amazing image. And could you just talk us through it?
Sure. So has everybody heard the old saying, a picture is worth? Right, I've heard that, but it didn't sink in. Somehow it took me 30,000 words to write about this photograph. Let me just introduce you to it, and then we can kind of plunge in. This image that you see here is a modern print from the glass plate negative, which now resides at the Smithsonian Institution. And the original size of the negative and the original size of the print is about 13 by 18 inches. So the real thing is about this size. So what do we see here? This is a photograph made by Alexander Gardner, as Cliff just said, made at Fort Laramie in 1868. And these 6 men are part of a federal peace commission, whose job is to move the Lakota onto a newly created reservation. Okay. I've seen this book, this photograph as an illustration, but I had never really thought about it before. And some years back, I began wondering if I could somehow bring together my interest in American history and my interest in the history of photography. And I began to wonder if I could identify people who have remained unidentified in some of the well-known images of the United States during the 19th century. As I said, I've seen prints of this, and on the prints, the men are always named, and the girl never is. In the beginning, I wondered if I could identify that gold miner, that railroad worker, if I could identify those dead bodies on the battlefield in Antietam. And I quickly realized if anybody could identify them, it would be a military expert. It wouldn't be me. But my interest then focused on this picture. So I know from the inscriptions, this is General Terry, a Yale-educated lawyer who became a military man. He's the man who found Custer and his men dead on the battlefield at the Little Bighorn. This is General William S. Harney, kind of the villain of my piece. And I believe there may be some Harney-related people in the audience today. I can talk a little bit about him later, but he was, as Cliff noted, called Woman Killer. Anybody recognize him? That's General Sherman, the important Union general during the Civil War, the unnamed child, who seems to be standing on a little box. If you look closely, her legs look just too long, so I think she's standing on like a crate or something behind her blanket. This is General John Sanborn, who was a lawyer, a political figure in Minnesota. This is Colonel Samuel Tappan, an activist, an abolitionist, and a man who has a very unusual life. And this is the wonderfully named Christopher Columbus Auger, who, among other things, guarded access to Lincoln's deathbed after he was shot at Ford's Theater. Men are always named. The girl is called Arapaho on one copy of this, and on the negative, she's just called Dakota. So I began to wonder if I could figure out who she was. And I don't know if you want me to talk about that.
Let's hold off on her for a few minutes.
Sure.
I just thought I'd ask you to reflect a bit about photographers and historians. You call Gardner a visual historian, and I've learned a lot about looking at photographs from you and about assumptions we might make. So can you just tell me your thoughts about that connection?
Sure. I mean, I think photographers and historians both want to describe something, right? They want to describe what they see, what they understand. They might focus on an event, a person, or whatever. Photographers have cameras, historians have pens. Similarly, they have to figure out where their picture or their story starts and ends. Gardner made a decision that you don't see who's standing over there. You don't see who's standing over here. He made a decision to put these people out in a field at Fort Laramie. You can't see the fort here. So actually, I don't know exactly where on the fort grounds this picture was made. There's many places it could have been made. So both of them are positioning where they're going to be. They both have to pick what moment they're going to focus on, right? Gardner is recording a split second of time, and a historian likewise has to figure out where the beginning and the end of her story will be. But I've often thought about the difference between me as a historian and Alexander Gardner here as a photographer. Gardner met these people. He probably knew what they smelled like after a few days out in the field. He might have been in the mess with them that morning. He knew what they had for breakfast. He probably knew what language the little girl was speaking that day. And I could tell you it could have been English, French, or Lakota. But I have a superpower as a historian. I know what happens to them next. Gardner was an eyewitness, but he knew them for a very short, compressed period of time. And really, the conceit of the whole book is that I figure out who they are, I follow them to this moment, the photograph gets made, Gardner goes off, and I watch them walk into the rest of their lives.
And one thing that happens after is that photographs are used for various purposes to make various arguments. And you show that so beautifully with Gardner's photographs of the railway, the future of the railway, and yet we look at those pictures now and they're pictures of
The past.
the past. So apart from not knowing who this girl was at the beginning, what were the challenges that faced you when you took on this task?
Well, I think finding out who she was the central challenge. Because honestly, I'm not a military historian. I'm not a diplomatic historian. And I never would have written this book about a photograph that didn't have her in it. It just wouldn't have interested me. Mm-hmm. So learning who she is the key to my curiosity here.
So as we approach her appearance at Laramie, you've selected two of these men as the focus of the book, and one is Harney, whom you mentioned as the villain of the piece, and the other is Gardner. So can you talk a little bit more about Harney and the world that he represents here? What did he do to become the villain of your piece?
Well, let me note here that General Harney, second from the left, tall, erect, military man, was born in 1800. He was born during the John Adams, not John Quincy Adams, but John Adams administration. He was born before Lewis and Clark went west. The girl in the middle, whom I'm not allowed to discuss yet, lived until 1936. She died during the FDR, the very long FDR administration. So in a single picture is somebody born in 1800 and somebody born in 1936. So there's a lot of history compressed into this picture. Harney drew my attention for a few reasons. One, he was an unbelievably, honestly, I think he was evil. He was mean, he was rough, he was rude, and he not only killed people in warfare, which we might accept to a certain degree, but he murdered someone in his own household. He murdered an enslaved woman who lived and worked in his house. And that intrigued me. How could somebody do that and then continue to rise up through the military ranks? He was one of the only Union generals to have been a slaveholder. Astonishingly, given the number of wars he was in, he lives to be nearly 90. And when I worked on this book, I fell down many research rabbit holes, and one of them was the story of the murder he committed. With the help of an archivist in St. Louis, I was able to locate the trial records, which have been buried since the 1930s in the basement of a rural Missouri courthouse. And I probably could have written a whole book on that murder. But just in a fit of fury, he picked up a piece of rawhide and whipped a woman to death. St. Louis was a slaveholding city, but even there, people were appalled. He fled for his life. He came back. He used his political pull to move. He was indicted twice for murder. He used his political power to move the trial to a rural town where people wouldn't know about him or hadn't read anything in the paper, and he got off. And he kind of rises up through the ranks from there.
Yeah. He's just unstoppable.
Yeah.
In his depravity. And Gardner, I mean, is he the hero of the piece, would you say? Tell us more about him.
I still think the girl is the heroine of the piece.
Okay.
But Gardner, the photographer, is a really interesting man. And I will say something about the kind of historian I am. I like to get down in the trenches, which anybody who looks at my footnotes will probably see. And quite a lot has been written about Gardner, but quite a lot of it is just repeating what someone said at a certain point. And going back to the archives to figure out his life, I'm left with many more questions than I had in the beginning. But he was born in Scotland in 1821, and he became a socialist. And in the late 1840s, he joins with some friends, and they have this idea. They're going to leave industrializing Scotland and go form a utopian colony on the American frontier. He's not able to leave with the other people when they leave for family reasons. He stays behind in Scotland. But his brothers and sister-in-law and everyone moves, and they end up creating a colony in Iowa. But these were tradespeople. They were watchmakers. They didn't know that much about farming. And their utopian experiment lasted until a huge summer downpour, and they were washed out, and the colony was over. We don't even know when Gardner comes to the United States, sometime in the mid-1850s. And we don't know, although people have said they know, we really do not know how and when he became a photographer. But by the late 1850s, he's working with Matthew Brady, the celebrated photographer based in New York, and he becomes the manager of Brady's Washington, D.C. gallery. And he's kind of like Zelig. I mean, he's just this guy from Glasgow, Scotland, and in the 1860s, he is eyewitness to everything. The killing fields at Gettysburg and Antietam. He's photographing Abraham Lincoln. He photographs the execution of the Lincoln conspirators. He photographs the construction of a rail line across the central United States in 1867. In 1868, he's the first person to photograph peace treaty negotiations. He's kind of everywhere. And the chaos of America in the 1860s gave him tremendous opportunities. It's ironic.
And his after story is also interesting. After this period.
Yeah, after these 2 trips west with the railroad and the peace commissioners, he goes back to Washington, D.C. He gets appointed or elected to be a member of the levee court in Washington, which is like the board of managers for the city. Only problem is he hadn't quite finished his citizenship application. So he hurriedly finishes that, becomes a citizen, and then is helping set the voting rules for Washington. But he pulls back from photography, and this took me a while to figure out. He founds mutual life insurance associations. It's like, wow, he was a utopian, and now he's helping people hedge their bets. But I came to understand that these mutual associations were intended to help you. You know, if you gave $1 a month, when you died, there would be hundreds of dollars to pay for your funeral. So again, it was kind of a return to the socialist impulses of his early days.
Can you just briefly tell us what it took for him to get this onto a negative and onto a piece of paper?
Sure. This is made with what's called a wet plate negative process. So first remember this, in the 19th century, there were not electric light bulbs. Every photographic, 19th century, most of the 19th century, photographic print you see is the same size as the negative. It was a contact print, okay? Happily, I'm guessing by looking at the age of people in this room, you actually know what real cameras are and dark rooms and film and all of that. Excellent. So in the 1860s, Gardner had to use what was called the wet plate negative process. So he would have a sheet of glass, and over it he would pour a thick, viscous mixture of gun cotton and ether, which is explosive. So he would tilt his hand while he's pouring this, and it would be sticky and cover the surface of the glass. And then he would dip that sticky glass sheet in light-sensitive silver nitrate solution, and that would stick to the sticky layer, which in turn is sticking to the glass. A wet plate negative had to be exposed and processed before it dried. Okay, this was a very laborious process, and you had to work mindfully of the time. So he would take that sticky, sensitized thing, put it in a plate holder, and then he would step out of his dark tent. He would walk over to where he had his big view camera set up. He would put the plate holder in. He would pull out the dark slide, and then he would take the cover off the, he would take off the lens cap. And probably this might have taken maybe a second to expose. It's not multiple seconds like some of you might think. Then he would put that back on, put the dark slide back on, and then he would have to take the negative back into his dark tent and develop it before it dried. So each shot, he was pretty good. Each one would take at least half an hour just to do that. Once you've developed the negative and let it dry, you can just varnish it, and then he took it back to Washington, D.C., to his studio to print. But you have to remember this, he had to take everything with him. He made about 50 prints that were big. He made about 100 smaller stereo views with a different camera here. So he's carrying all that glass. He has pans, he has beakers, he has chemicals. People complained about the water in the Laramie River. Heaven knows where he got the water he needed to do all of this. So he traveled with a lot of equipment.
So we have a sense of the craft, the labor, and also the commercial element. And Whitman said of him that he was an artist and that he saw further than the camera, which I think is what you're doing in this book, seeing much further than the camera. Let's talk for a moment about 1868, and you've already talked about Harney murdering an enslaved woman. How does the framework or context of Reconstruction inform the story that you're telling here?
Okay, well, all of these men had just fought in the Civil War. At this particular moment, Sherman is like the chief military officer of the United States, except for General Grant, and Terry on that end and Augur on this end work beneath him, overseeing huge military divisions of the West. And they're responsible for ensuring the safety of the people constructing the railroads, and they're responsible for ensuring the safety of people on the overland trails who are migrating west. Let me tell you, when you have that job, you're not all that disposed to think about the interests of the Native people with whom you're negotiating a treaty. So we're in a post-Civil War moment, and the congressmen who sent these people west had an idea of how you bring people into the nation, because who had they just tried this with? The freed people, right? What were they giving the freed people? Schools, churches, citizenship, theoretically a right to vote. And they thought they could take that same toolkit west with them, and that's how they would bring Native people into the United States. But that's not what these people wanted. They wanted to secure the right to their land. They wanted the continued right to hunt. They wanted access to the bison and to their other food sources. So it was a mismatch of...
And a terrible misreading of what the Native peoples wanted. You take us in and among the Native peoples as they're gathered up into this conversation, this peace treaty. Can you tell us about their experience and what you discovered reading the documents around the Peace Commission?
Well, I think this is actually one of the things that surprised me. Harney here had been out west for a few decades before he comes to Fort Laramie in 1868. If the government found somebody who wasn't disposed to making a peace, but they did find someone who was very experienced in negotiating with different tribal communities. What astonished me diving into the sources for this is that he, at Fort Laramie, starts meeting people he'd met in the 1850s. sometimes even earlier. And sometimes these people are carrying around little pieces of paper that he had given them a decade or 2 decades before, promising to look on them with favor. So when you think how chaotic these people's lives are, they're moving every season, they're moving with the weather, they're moving to avoid war, and these men are holding on to these little pieces of paper, which unfortunately they thought would protect them, and which unfortunately they thought made them powerful. And Harney knew just how much his signature was really worth. Nothing.
Yeah, it's remarkable. And you paint a picture of sort of the very last burst of nation-to-nation dealing in this, because they will not be dealt with as tribes soon after this.
Yeah, this treaty was negotiated in 1868, and just 3 years later, in 1871, Congress abolishes the practice of treating Native nations as independent nations that they would negotiate on a nation-to-nation basis with. Yeah. So what used to be treaties now become agreements.
Yeah, big difference. Mm-hmm. So the girl in the middle.
Oh, thank you. Okay.
Tell us, how did she come into focus for you, and what did you learn about her?
I learned so much more about her than I ever could have imagined. Where do you start on a project like that? I thought maybe she's the daughter of one of the headmen, one of the leading Native people who came in to sign the treaty. But I read all the commission papers, I read the personal papers of these people. There didn't seem to be anyone like that. Then I thought, well, maybe she's a translator, a very young translator. And I found out who all the translators were here, and there were no women among them, although they had worked with a woman translator the year before. Finally, in the archives of the Fort Laramie National Historic Site, which is what Fort Laramie, it was, at this moment it's in Dakota Territory, it's now within the state of Wyoming. In the archives there, I found a little note card that was written in 1978 by a man named Eddie Ryan, and he'd come through the fort. He saw a modern copy of this picture, and he said it was his grandmother. And he said her name was Sophie Mousseau. Now, Mr. Ryan was no longer alive for me to interview, and he's what we might, in your business, call an unreliable narrator. He claimed to be descended from Marie Antoinette, and I'm not so sure about that. But a name is such a powerful thing. A name is what connects you to the records. A name is what connects you to the archives. And quite quickly, I realized that the person named Sophie Mousseau had died in 1936, and that Mr. Ryan was born in 1906. So his grandmother was alive the first 30 years of his life. There was no reason to doubt that he might not have recognized her. But that name opened up everything. It turns out that her father was a French Canadian from Quebec who had wandered west as a young man. His name was M.A. Mousseau. And her mother was a Lakota woman named Yellow Woman. And, when you're writing a book like this, sometimes you don't know when you should stop researching, like what really is just beyond the bend, which is what is too much and what could really pay off for you. This was a payoff one. This picture's made in 1868. 13 years before, in 1855, General Harney, second from the left, led a vindictive assault on a peaceful Lakota village in what's now western Nebraska called Blue Water Creek. His men murdered dozens of people, and his men shot a young mother named Yellow Woman in the leg. And they took her baby and used it for target practice. The woman survived, and she, with the other surviving women and children, was rounded up and forcibly marched into Fort Laramie. In that same assault on the Lakota village, Harney realized that the Native people had ammunition provided them by French traders. There were many, many French-Canadian traders on this part of the Northern Plains. So he rounded up those traders and made them come into Fort Laramie. Yellow Woman, M.A. Mousseau, met at the fort. They married. They became Sophie's parents, and they remained married for over half a century. So in the weirdest of ways, the evil General Harney was a matchmaker. But it does mean that when the girl is here, her parents damn well know who that man is. Absolutely.
So Sophie, you say, never left a scrap of paper, never left a letter, didn't write, there are no interviews with her. She's a character, not a narrator. Tell us how you pieced her story together.
Because her father and her first husband both became litigious, I learned a lot about her. M.A. Mousseau lived a long time. He lived so long that he was one of those people that journalists would track down, like to hear about the old days. So he told his stories about the old days in the early 20th century. But it also happens that M.A. Mousseau had a bunch of road ranches, which is what they were called, around Fort Laramie. And he would take in horses that Western travelers had just worn out, and he would sell them new ones, nurse the old ones back to health, sell those, et cetera. Multiple times in the 1850s and 60s, bands of Native people raided his ranches. And there was a law in the United States that you could file for reparations with the federal government if that happened to you. So he filed claim after claim after claim after claim, describing what happened to him. And in doing that, he's describing where he lived. He's describing what people destroyed. And he gives us a kind of picture of what
they
the
had.
material culture of Sophie's life.
Yeah.
Her first husband is an Irish Civil War soldier, Irish Civil War vet. She marries when she's a teenager. She's about 8 years old in this picture. She marries when she's a teenager. She has 5 children, and then her husband falls in love with a white woman, kidnaps their 5 children, including a nursing baby, and banishes her to Pine Ridge, a Lakota reservation. A few years later, he murders his second wife and his stepdaughter. And so we know quite a lot about him because the trial was a cause célèbre. One of her children becomes the first Lakota lawyer, and he leaves a trail through the historical archives. But, you know, for the later decades of her life, it's really the government that's keeping track of her, the censuses of people living at Pine Ridge.
Right. One of the phases of the Mousseau's existence is this question of being mixed blood. And I wonder if you could talk about what that meant. What did it mean to make a bid for a mixed blood reservation in that world?
Yeah, you know, when her parents got together in the 1850s, there weren't that many white women on the Northern Plains, and many of these French-Canadian traders, for strategic reasons and personal reasons, married Native women. 1860s, 70s, 80s, as more white families are moving west, as more white women are moving west, the kind of tolerant racial climate that existed early on begins to fracture.
Right.
So Sophie has a white father and a Lakota mother. Her second husband has a white father and Lakota mother. So her children are, one quarter Native from that second family. From her first family, the children are 1/8 Native. And some identify as white, some identify as Indian, and they move in different directions.
Yeah, yeah. And the lines are going to get less and less blurry and more clear.
Right. Well, if you live on a reservation, you get certain benefits. If you're enrolled in a tribe, you get particular benefits. Yeah.
So you have this wonderful phrase, the tangle of chance and circumstance. And you just talked to us about this coincidence or this connection whereby Harney brings the parents of Sophie together. I wonder if you could just pause over that, these convergences that happen periodically in the book. Somebody will rescue somebody who was already, we've read about. I mean, is this just a function of doing so much research that you find these things? Or is this about a world in which people are in motion and disrupted and moving around, as difficult as travel is, What do you make of that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think I come away from this project understanding that the West is a really big world. It takes a really long time when you don't have a car or you don't have a train to get from here to there. On the other hand, it's a really small world. 5 of these 6 men had an intimate relationship with President Lincoln.
Yeah.
So they're united through that. And Gardner, of course, had photographed Lincoln. So there's a little link. The year before this picture was made, these peace commissioners are negotiating with tribes on the southern plains. And one day they walk into a fort and they run into a photographer, and it's Gardner, who had photographed many of them, 4 of them, in his Washington studio. Mm-hmm. Now, there aren't that many ways to travel, right?
Yeah.
Everybody would take the train as far as it went, and then you would pick up your wagons, and then you would go to the next fort, and you would stock up to take your wagons wherever you want to be. So they just happened to meet at one of those hubs, from which all these folks emanate, and that meeting is what led to him working for them the last year, just in the middle of Kansas, in the middle of nowhere. They ran into each other.
It's amazing. One thing I noted the other day was we read a lot about place and travel and geography, but there are no maps in the book. So you are mapping these for us in your words. And I just wondered, a lot of these are places St. Louis is where you're from, you visited Pine Ridge Reservation. How do you write place to give a sense of what it took to get across it?
I probably should have included maps. I think a lot of the time when I write, I'm trying to figure out something for myself.
Yeah.
So when I read that Sophie's first husband at Fort Laramie banishes her to Pine Ridge, I actually did a lot of research to figure out how long it would take for her to get there and how hard it would be for her to come back to visit her children. And the answer is very hard, like days. So I would.
You really give us those,
Yeah, thank goodness for Google Maps, right? And Google Maps wants to tell you how fast you can drive somewhere, but you can click around and find out how fast you could walk somewhere, and then you can research a walking pace versus a horseback pace and figure it out. But when I read these reports, and they're in Omaha, then they're on the Platte River, then they're there, I didn't really have a good grasp of where that was. So I'm often thinking, they would have to go up the river for 2 days to get to that place and then walk for 1 day to get to that place. I had to sort it out for myself.
Well, you really lodged that in your reader. I think that's something that I just couldn't have grasped without this account. So I want to mention an op-ed that you wrote recently that I thought was marvelous, and it was about the disappearance of names and the importance of naming. And I just wondered if you could tell us in a nutshell what you were arguing there and why this is a timely book.
Yeah, should I say thank goodness for the Trump administration for giving me a hook? No. I think everybody's familiar with what's happened to many historical websites in the last 2 months, right? Websites are being taken down, but also people's names are being removed from websites. There's been some published pushback against some of those edits, but some names have disappeared. So I just wrote a piece about how important names are and how important it is to have particular people who embody the stories of our past. And although the government has been removing the names of prominent people, whether it's Jackie Robinson or Enola Gay, from these websites, names like Sophie's matter too. So at a moment when people are taking names out, I'm trying to put a name in because I really think everybody's story matters. And if you look at this picture and you don't know who the girl is, and if you think hard about this picture, you can go, okay, these men are playing a public role, but probably they have families too. So you can begin to think about that. You can begin to think about their personal lives. But when you know who Sophie is, it's a really different picture. So why is she there? Maybe the photographer wanted somebody for a sense of scale since you don't see any trees or buildings here. But General Harney over there, he was still powerful. And her father had once worked for him. Maybe her father, whose ranch has just been burned down, needs work. And he wants to be right there in Harney's face. I should note among the coincidences that when her father, the family flees to Fort Laramie after their ranch is burned, he gets there and he sees horses that have been stolen from him.
He recognizes the
He
horse.
recognizes his horses, or says he does. But by the time he gets to the fort, he's also found a lawyer to help him prosecute these claims against the federal government. And it's that guy. It's a total conflict of interest. The money he would get in reparations would be taken out of the annuities given to the tribe, and this guy is negotiating what those annuities would be. That conflict of interest didn't seem to bother people so much in the 19th century. I guess they don't bother people that so much right now, do they? So maybe her father and mother are there because they're currying favor from Harney. Maybe they want the girl there because the lawyer has asked them to prove that they are at the fort where they just saw their horses, so he can help them press their claims for reparations. In the end, it's unknowable.
Mm-hmm. It's unknowable.
Yeah.
We, among us, probably have a lot of photographs that are in one of two places, in albums or in shoeboxes, right? That's where
Or
photos,
cell phones.
or on your phone.
Yeah.
Well, those are digital, but I mean prints. I know people are writing to you for advice about this. I just wonder if you have any advice for our audience about what to do with family photos. Princeton had a fascinating sort of crowdsourcing of identifying photos in Romans Broadway's album a few years ago, and just brought everyone together. Can we, as a community, name these people? But I just wondered what you're telling people who come to you.
Well, I'm telling people to write names on the back of their photographic prints, right? There's so many things that you take for granted. You're always going to recognize your mother, and you're always going to recognize your grandmother, but your grandkids might not recognize your grandmother. So I do encourage people to write names down. And let me just say one other thing about this picture of her. I was almost done writing this book. I'm in touch with several of her descendants now. I placed a kind of ad in the Lakota Times and asked for descendants to contact me, and they did. Right when I was finishing this book, another picture of her came to my attention. None of the relatives had any other photographs of her. And the picture, this is made in 1868. The picture I found, a bad, blurry halftone in a little souvenir brochure, was from 1891. So she was, 23 years older. The later picture has a name on it, Sophia Musso. But, when I looked at it, the woman was short, she was dark-complected, but the face was neither an obvious yes nor an obvious no. Lots of people think AI solves these problems, right? And I contacted some people here in Princeton in the Digital Humanities Lab to help me. And the multiple AI programs they tried told me that this person is 30 and that the older woman is a man. So it shows that AI, which I think a lot of people hope will help them recognize their photographs. One, you have to have an identified photograph to start with before AI can help you. But AI programs have not been tested on 19th century photographs, which have a different kind of information, or on probably non-European peoples who have different facial structures. So, label your family photos.
Label your family photos. All right, we're going to open it up. I'm sure there are questions and comments from the audience. There's a mic going around. Just raise your hand and please speak into the mic. Cliff. Yeah.
Thank you very much. My first question has to do with something you said just a few seconds ago about that you're in touch with some of her descendants. Are these descendants mostly enrolled Lakota, or are they not enrolled tribe members at this point, or both?
Both.
Yeah.
And some of them are descendants from her white husband, and some of her descendants on the Lakota husband side.
The Lakota ones, how are they doing in their lives? How healthy and successful are they right now?
The one I've been closest in touch with has worked as head of the tourism bureau for her tribe, and she's well educated. Her husband is a college administrator. So they're doing okay, but I did go speak at the tribal college at Pine Ridge, and if anybody who's been there knows it's a very, very poor part of the United States.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Marty. Before you came across the identification from her grandson, how hard had you looked, and where, and how did you try, what sources did you try to find in order to identify her
Before I learned her name.
before you did?
Yeah, I was alluded to that briefly before. I tried the theory that she's a chief's or a headman's daughter. I tried the theory that she's a translator. So I read through all of the reports that were generated by this commission, including their daily reports. And then I went through the correspondence that's been saved in the National Archives between these people during the 2 years they're actually out west negotiating with different tribes. And I should say, Gardner did make 100 small and 50 large pictures, and I looked through all of them, and it doesn't appear anywhere else. So that was hard. I also looked through photographs. There were just 3 or 4 photographers who had been to Fort Laramie before spring of 1868, and she's certainly not in those photographs either. Jill?
Yeah.
Thank you, Marty, and sorry, I'm really looking forward to reading the book. How intentional was Gardner about the composition of the photograph? I'm really fascinated by where people's gazes are going at one another or not. You said that she's standing on a box. Why would that be? Why would he want her to have that kind of height? And it's really interesting that she's looking out along with the evil man, but the other people are looking either at one another or away from the camera. Was that intentional?
There's no other photograph in the other 150 that's anything like this. This is weirdly formal, right? And symmetrical,
Yeah.
look in, look out, look over her head. It's weird. I can't really say what Gardner said to them. Obviously, he orchestrated it because he's standing back and he can see the whole arc. She may be standing on a box because her blanket's so long and she was tripping over it. I don't know. I showed this slide one time when I was giving a talk in Florence, Italy. I was just starting work on this, and everybody raised their hand and said, you could tell that Gardner has looked at lots of Renaissance paintings because look how the men's feet are pointing. And I'm going, no. I'm a historian, I know about his life, and he was not hanging out in Italian churches looking at Renaissance painting. So it's a good question, and I don't know, but it stands out for being so weirdly organized.
Hi. The second man from the right, whose name I forget,
Tappan.
can you tell us about the girl that he became his ward?
You must have read the book. Okay.
I love the book.
In 1864, there was yet another massacre led mostly by Colorado troops against a Cheyenne community in southeastern Colorado, and it's known as Sand Creek, or the massacre at Sand Creek. There was a little girl that was orphaned there. She saw her 2 parents murdered as she hid under their bodies. A few years later, the Cheyenne refused to negotiate with the peace commissioners unless their captives are returned. That little girl had been taken captive by some of the Colorado troops. They named her Minnehaha. They think they knew one girl's native name from reading Longfellow's poem. And the Cheyenne wouldn't negotiate unless she was returned. Somehow Tappan gets involved. He goes to get the girl, and he's single, he's not married. He brings her back to Boston to be raised by mesmerists because he has become a mesmerist. These are people who talk to spirits. So she is enrolled in a mesmerist school. She's living with a famous mesmerist herself. And then Tappan marries the nation's most famous mesmerist, who hangs out in Washington, D.C., channeling dead presidents to help living senators figure out how to execute Reconstruction. So Tappan becomes her guardian. He sends her to Howard University, which was created to educate freed slaves, but they had a few slots for Native children as well. And sadly, she dies there of TB when she's still quite young. But what a terrible, traumatic, and crazy life she had. Another research rabbit hole. Okay, well, speak loud for everybody.
We need it for the recording, actually, sorry.
No problem. I know you did a lot of research, lots and lots. How much of the research was left book?
I'm going to say I know that he's a journalist, and so I understand where this question comes from. I cut a few hundred pages at the end. I just got too into the stories, and I probably should have cut some more, I'll be honest. I got too into the story of the murder of the enslaved woman. I got too into the mesmerist wife. Yeah, a few hundred pages.
My question is more from admiration. The amount of work you know you have to do as a get.
Yeah, and I will say that I didn't have a vision for this book in the beginning because this is a narrative challenge, again, to speak to your discipline. How do you create a narrative about a split second of time? This is a split second of time. So where's the story? It's not like writing a book about the Civil War. It starts, at a certain moment, or maybe its precursors are there, and then it happens, and there's these battles, and then there's the peace at Appomattox, and the soldiers go home. There's no inherent narrative here. So a trick was kind of inventing one. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for a fascinating talk. You mentioned marriages a couple of times. Can you tell us anything about who performed the marriages out there, and were they registered in any way? Did they?
Mm-hmm. So her first marriage to her first Irish husband, the one who becomes her murderer, was what people called a mariage à la façon du pays, just marriage in the fashion of the country. So it was informal, and when he decided he wanted to be divorced, it was just a matter of stealing the children and sending her away. I've seen announcements for her marriage to her second Lakota husband, and he was quite involved in the Catholic Church, and I can't tell you if there are records for that. I haven't seen them. Her parents, the people who met at Fort Laramie in the aftermath of that murderous assault, were married in an informal way, but then formalized their marriage once they moved to Pine Ridge, perhaps because it helped them get different kinds of government benefits if they could prove their marriage. It's an interesting question.
Hi, I too am curious about the way the each individual is posing, but it particularly strikes me that Sherman is snubbing Harney, and I'm wondering, did you find any commentary about his thoughts about the man?
Oh, that's a good question. But I think the two men on the either side of the girl have just been told to look over her head, so I don't know that it's a particular snub, but Sherman didn't really like Harney. Harney couldn't play by the rules, and Sherman, as the top general, believed that playing by the rules was important. Harney would always do what he wasn't supposed to do. He would overspend money, and somehow he kept getting away with it. But I will say he gets his own at the end. His children all sue him at the end.
Thank you for doing the research and bringing all this to light. There were 39 million people in 1870, so the possibility of people meeting each other and having repeated interactions was a lot easier than it is today. Travel also wasn't as difficult as we imagine. I mean, my 3 times great-grandfather traveled from Germany to Trinidad in 1830, and there was a lot of commerce going on and things like that. So I see that what was going on was a little simpler in those ways than we think today. And the only thing I'm going to say about the photographs that you have is, yes, write the names on them, but it is easier to rebuild your history than you think. I've managed to do that, and the only thing I'd say is get the stories from your family along with the photographs, because that's the hardest part to bring back. But thanks.
Yeah, that's an excellent point.
Thank you. This was riveting. I have two questions. One is if you've ever found a print from this negative. I know it's a copy negative and it looks like it was broken. And two, if there were any models that you used for this very brave feat of writing about a single photograph for a book, if there were kind of examples that you turned to.
To answer your second question first, I didn't find any. I was just flying by the seat of my pants trying to figure this out. Yes, I've seen maybe 4 or 5 prints of this. I mean, Gardner went to great lengths to make these negatives, and he hardly made any prints. Every single copy that I've seen is either in the papers of one of the commissioners or someone who worked for what they called the Indian Bureau at the time. So they seem to have been a work for hire as opposed to something he used for commercial purposes.
Hello, Marnie.
Hi.
Nice to see you again. This was such a fabulous discussion, and you've put in so much work to this. So my easy question is, what are you going to do next?
I'm going to write a book that doesn't have footnotes in it.
Nice.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. This was fabulous. This is a question from ignorance. How many images of children, of Native children, do we have from this period? Because that's so striking that she's so young.
So, I didn't really talk about Gardner's larger body of work at Fort Laramie here. When he used his big camera, he tended to take more formal pictures. But when he used his smaller stereo camera, which was a little easier to maneuver, he often went into the Indian encampments. And many of those pictures are actually pretty informal. There's pictures of women cooking, children might be around their mothers while they're tanning a hide or something like that. And it's really the first group of those kinds of daily life pictures that include children in less formal portrait sittings that we have. So thank you for asking that and reminding me to mention that.
Thank you so much for this talk. I am fascinated and horrified by the person of Harney, and clearly his murder, the murder he committed, didn't affect his military advancement, but he does get as you note, the nickname woman killer among the Lakota. Is that a reference to this murder, or is it a reference to other crimes he's committed?
It's a reference to his violence on the battlefields in the West. And I will say that the highest peak in the Black Hills until pretty recently, it's always had a Lakota name, but until pretty recently it was formerly known as Harney Peak. It was named for him in the 1850s, and about 6 years ago it was renamed, and it's now Black Elk Peak. But I will note that, South Dakota's former governor, Kristi Noem, is now in a position of power. And I have an op-ed ready to go for when they try to rename it Harney Peak again. Yeah.
Okay, I think this will have to be our last question.
Thank you. Thanks for framing this in terms of your motivating question and giving us a taste of the research journey and the personalities. But I'd like to ask for a moment to reflect back on the photograph itself and what Gardner's intention was. Why the girl in the middle?
Well, great question. As I said, we really don't know why she's there. I see why Gardner, as an artist, would welcome her there, because she just makes the picture more interesting, right? But we don't know. Not only is this body of work a body of work that does include children, especially in the small format views, but I will say this is the most formal of all of the pictures in the series. So it's, why is the girl there? Why are the commissioners arrayed together in such a formal kind of line? Gardner left almost no writing. In the course of my research, I found 2 letters he wrote that scholars didn't know about before that were published in obscure newspapers. And the only writing I found in his handwriting are letters he sent to his son's school when he was being scolded for not paying the tuition. So it's a tricky thing, because we know where Gardner was, right? On a certain day, he was at Fort Laramie. On a certain day, he photographed Lincoln. On a certain day, he photographed the execution of the Lincoln conspirators. So we can chart his movements, but it's extremely hard to know what he was thinking, really just about anything. And that was a big challenge here.
Okay, and with that, I think we should thank Marnie and Esther one more time. Interested, I understand that Marnie will be doing a signing, so please join Labyrinth Books over here at the table to purchase copies and personalize them.